Hello everybody, in this presentation today I'd like to take a look at what we call the Middle Ages or medieval world, focusing on three things central to everyday life: what people ate and drank, what they did in their spare time, and their attitudes to sex. Some of the presentation will make serious academic points about medieval life, whilst other bits could be described as being a little more whimsical. I hope you enjoy both. In some of the sections there is some material which you could describe as being risque. I'll let you guess which ones. At the end of the day though, we're all mature adults, so I hope no one will be offended. We still, at our age, the autumn of our years, like to think that we still enjoy sex, sport and drinking. But in reality, we remain proficient in only one of those interests, and unfortunately, it's the one that's not very good for you. If you look at the two pictures on the slide, you can see typical activities which retired people like myself would get involved in. On the left, there's secret drinking of wine, often in the basement or garage of your own home, and on the right hand side, a typical gathering of old people socialising together, although one or two of the company around that table seem to have overindulged a little bit more than some of the others. But when and where exactly were the Middle Ages or medieval times? Much of the study of this period focuses on Europe, as European scholars were the most prevalent in the study of this field. However, we mustn't forget that a Eurocentric view of the world doesn't give the full picture. We already know that the Arabic world was rich with scientific knowledge during this period, and Spain, for example, under Moorish rule for 7 centuries, acted as a conduit for that knowledge to spread throughout northern Europe. Then there was China. Even within Europe, the experiences of the English peasantry were quite different from, say, their Italian counterparts, especially in sport, food and drink, and possibly sex. Please don't show this map to Vladimir Putin, as it contradicts his view that Ukraine never existed and was always a part of Russia. In the year 950, the western part of what we know today as Russia was part of a state called Kievan Rus. Muscovy as a state and the basis of modern Russia was not formed until 1283. Even at that time it was dwarfed by the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which in the 13th century controlled vast parts of Poland, Belarusia, Ukraine and the Baltic states, as well as Western Russia today. The timing of the Middle Ages again is a little Eurocentric, as experts consider it starting from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 until 1492, with the fall of Granada, the end of Moorish rule in Europe, and in the same year Columbus landing in America. It is of course a very long period, over 1,000 years, and although technological advances were rare, it was a very different world at the start and finish of that era. If you were to then place great moments in Arabic or Chinese history on this chart, it would indeed look very different. To emphasise the point that Europe was not the centre of the world in the Middle Ages, just look closely at this map of the largest cities in the world in the year 950. The only cities in Europe to feature in the top 7 were Cordoba and Constantinople. You can see enormous populations to the east and even in Africa and Central America. To put the European figures in perspective, around the year 1000, Cordoba had a population of 450,000, London 20,000, Paris 20,000 and Venice 60,000. Baghdad at the time was over 600,000 people. So this was a very Eurocentric worldview, but Asia, Africa and the Arab world were all making huge advancements in scientific and medical theory at this time. Despite what we used to learn in school, white people have never made up the entire world. The Chinese had a massively advanced scientific culture by this time. Meanwhile, Arabic scientists in Cordoba were compiling treatises on cataract surgery in the 10th century. During the golden years of the Cordoba Caliphate before its fall in 1031, there have been considerable advances in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, botany, pharmacology, navigation, and other scientific areas. You can see on the chart that historians consider there was a linear growth of technology and society until the Middle Ages, when the world, from a European perspective, went into decline. Indeed, the idea of the Dark Ages actually originated in the medieval period itself. An Italian called Petrarch, the poet laureate of 14th century Rome, was actually the originator of the idea that there was a period of stagnation that Europe was moving out of. But he had a political axe to grind. He considered that any point at which Rome, where he lived and worked, and had considerable sway, did not completely dominate the world, was indeed a bad time. So this was not an unbiased assessment of world history. What strikes me personally is that this period to a large extent coincides with the decline of Islamic influence in Spain and the Mediterranean. But what of the word medieval itself and how we use it today in everyday life? It really doesn't have a very good reputation, does it? We can say that medieval has been used to describe anything related to backwardness, ignorance, lack of culture, unwholesome habits, barbarity, cruelty, fanaticism, horror, poverty, monstrosity, and violence. Images spring into our minds like the ones on the slide. On the left you can see a typical scene of medieval domestic bliss, whereas on the right a typical medieval scene of mass hanging, drawing and quartering, which at the time was a very popular leisure activity. Things were so bad back in the Middle Ages that listening to presentations like this, you can actually play a game of medieval bingo and tick off the boxes as we go along. Everybody died young. People never washed. No one drank water, and there was no medical knowledge. But what was life really like in the Middle Ages? During the High Middle Ages, the population of Europe grew from 35 to 80 million. That's between the years of 1000 and 1347, probably due to improved agricultural techniques and a more mild climate. 90% of the European population remained rural peasants, gathered into small communities of manors or villages. Towns grew up around castles and were often fortified by walls in response to disorder and raids from pirates and other outlaws. Javia is a prime example of this, with its fortified church to protect it from pirate raids from the Barbary coast and Granada. Daily life for peasants consisted of working the land. Life was harsh, with a limited diet and little comforts. Women were subordinate to men in both the peasant and noble classes, and were expected to ensure the smooth running of the household. Children had a 50% survival rate beyond the age of 1 and began to contribute to family life around the age of 12. However, was it any better in Victorian times, when the factory had replaced the fields and when children were still sent out to work at a very young age? But let's start to take a more detailed look at some aspects of medieval life and start with our favourite. And our favourite is, of course, alcohol, a pleasure we can still indulge in even in the autumn of our years. although it looks like the guy on the left in the photograph has indulged a little bit too much. Of course, the production of alcohol varied greatly by country depending on climate. Its consumption varied by social class as well. But let's explore one popular myth about water and alcohol to start. Did people really drink beer rather than water? Now this is quite a complicated slide, so bear with me please. Beer was undoubtedly a lot weaker than it is today. It is estimated that on average it was around 1%. So when a contemporary source says nuns had an allowance of 6 pints of beer a day, they were not drinking Stella Artois or even San Miguel, but a very weak and refreshing drink. This particular type of beer was very similar to a drink that is available in Eastern Europe today called kvass, which is a very light alcoholic drink made by fermenting bread. However, it's a popular myth that people were forced to drink beer as the water quality was so poor. Let's remember that most people lived in rural environments. There was plenty of water and it was fresh in rural environments, unlike when in later times people migrated to cities. We can easily work out the claim that most people drank beer rather than water as being false by just looking at grain production estimates at the time. We have a very good idea how much grain was produced and how much of that was used for ale production in England at the time, for example. The population of England in 1300 was 4.25 million, including about 3.5 million adults. An average intake of liquid a day was around 3.5 pints, so that accounts for 560 gallons a year, but obviously a little more if heavy physical labour was being carried out, which invariably it was. To produce that amount of beer, it would need something like 5 million quarters of raw grain, which was around 80% of the total production of grain at that time. There would simply not have been enough grain left over for bread production and animal food. And bread, of course, was a major part of the diet, much more important than it is today. In reality, less than 10% of grain production at this time was used for ale, enough for about half a pint a day for each adult, and on average the consumption of beer in 14th century England was around half the recommended alcohol intake advised by the UK government today. But there were other drinks apart from beer, and wine was becoming increasingly popular. Wine was the drink of choice for the upper classes and anyone who could afford it. It was produced all over medieval Europe, and due to the medieval warm period that prevailed over Western Europe until the 14th century, the climate meant it could be produced as far north as northern England. Indeed, at the end of the 11th century, there were over 50 large vineyards in England, most associated with monasteries. Wine, however, was expensive, and buying a small barrel was beyond the means of most people. But taverners bought it in bulk and sold it by the cup, so for a penny or a halfpenny, an English peasant could enjoy a Bordeaux red. England accounted for 80% of Bordeaux exports. For much of the Middle Ages, the English controlled Bordeaux, so England as an export destination was very popular. In medieval England, the wine drunk was mainly red wine from Bordeaux and Gascony. Rhenish white from the German states was twice as expensive and was favoured by the upper classes. Spanish white wines, such as sherry, were cheaper, and sweet wines from Greece, Crete and Cyprus, such as Romagné and Malmsey, were popular after dinner. Wine was also used in medical situations, and was a common cure for multiple ailments. This, unfortunately, is an aspect that we have lost sight of these days. I mentioned the vineyards of England controlled by the monasteries earlier. After the fall of the Roman Empire, monasteries became the main centres of brewing and winemaking techniques. Home production of rustic beers continued, but the art of brewing essentially became the province of monks, and they carefully guarded that knowledge. Monks brewed virtually all beer of good quality until the 12th century, so alcohol in the Middle Ages depended heavily on the monks. During the Middle Ages, the monks maintained all knowledge of vine growing. They had the resources, security, and stability to improve the quality of their vines slowly over time. Also, the monks had the education and time necessary to enhance their viticultural skills. So throughout the Middle Ages, monasteries owned and tended the best vineyards. Of course, wine was necessary to celebrate the Mass, and the monasteries also produced large quantities to support themselves. People made most wine for local consumption, yet some wine trade did continue in spite of the poor roads at the time. But how much alcohol was actually consumed? While medieval people weren't inebriated all the time, they definitely got drunk on occasion. Medieval doctors even recommended hangover cures for the morning after a rough night. In the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a southern Italian medical school, doctors warned, if you develop a hangover from drinking at night, drink again in the morning, it will be the best medicine. That advice has really stood the test of time, hasn't it? Another cure was raw eel with some ground bitter almonds. This was prescribed to cure a hangover. I think personally I prefer the hair of the dog cure. The English court physician John of Gaddesden, who lived from 1280 to 1361, in his medical treatise, the Rosa Medicinae, recommended a testicle treatment. If anyone have drunk too much, if it be a man, the testicles should be washed with salt and vinegar, and if it be a woman, the breasts. Also let them eat the leaf or stalk or the juice of a cabbage with sugar. It wasn't just an English thing. The Italians got in on the testicle cure too. You could always try dried bull's penis or pizzle, which was a word derived from the Dutch word pezzel, meaning sinew, but was something Sicilians swore by to relieve hangovers. Alcoholism, how prevalent was it? But firstly, another question. Who likes football? Who can remember the Euro 1996 games, England versus Scotland, and Paul Gascoigne's goal celebration? If you remember, a week before the tournament, he'd been filmed in a dentist chair with his teammates pouring alcohol into him. That scene was reenacted on the pitch in celebration of his goal. When I saw this picture, it seemed to be a medieval version of the goal celebration. The church obviously had a massive influence over people's lives at this time, and in the Middle Ages the church regarded excessive consumption of alcohol as a sin, one of the 7 deadly sins, that of gluttony. However, we really need to separate out the rhetoric of the church away from the daily lives of normal people, and indeed away from the daily life of most of the churchmen, and then a different picture emerges. As well as being part of the sin of gluttony, alcohol could lead to other sins such as theft, violence and sex, as opposed to reproduction. We'll hear more of that later. But especially for women, alcohol was said to heat the body and arouse it to lust. So a dangerous thing. However, it must be remembered that alcohol, particularly in medieval England this time, was relatively weak. Beer was typically 1%, and distillation of spirits was not widespread until the 16th century. Wine was stronger, but it was more expensive and thus out of reach on a regular basis for most people. And grain production at the time indicated an average adult in England consumed 3 pints of wheat beer per week. We all have an image of the medieval tavern, probably along the lines of the prancing pony in Peter Jackson's film of The Lord of the Rings. If you ask an artificial intelligence app, as I did, to show a picture of a medieval tavern, it will produce an image something like the one on the left, with a dusky serving wench, serving a boisterous but largely well-behaved male clientele. In reality, it was a place for families to gather, and the staff were probably not as enticing as the picture on the left, and probably closer to the one on the right. So the tavern was at the centre of village or town life, and an evening spent socialising there was quite common for a lot of people. But this did not sit well with the church, which described the tavern as being the chapel of the devil. Now a little bit about diet in general, not just alcohol. We're all accustomed to seeing Hollywood and other films where medieval banquets are shown with copious amounts of meat served. Whilst meat consumption varied according to social class, it wasn't as prevalent as popular culture portrays. Diet varied enormously in medieval Europe, largely based on climate, but also on historical development and in particular the influence of migration. For example, the Moorish influence in Spain and later the Norman invasion in Britain. In northern countries, the climate was too harsh for production of citrus fruits, olive oil, grapes, and certain types of nuts and vegetables. So in those countries, including England, a vegetarian, largely cereal-based diet developed, heavy on bread and porridge. It changed a little after the Norman conquest with the introduction of different cooking methods. Earlier, the Normans had conquered Sicily from the Moors and had adopted some of their cooking styles and ingredients. Further south, what we know as the Mediterranean diet had already taken shape. Spain in particular with its Moorish influence, had developed a diet more based on fish, olive oil, citrus fruits and vegetables that the Moors introduced, like aubergines, for example. Rice was also introduced to Spain by the Moors, who took it originally from China. Italy too, due to climate, had already developed a similar diet, and pasta was common from the 13th century, though it was made from rice flour at the time, not wheat, so a true gluten-free product. So in most regions and countries, the staple diet of people was cereal-based, be it bread, porridge, pasta or pizza. This was supplemented by cheese, fruit and vegetables for the lower classes, and apart from special occasions, meat was reserved for the higher classes. Game was the sole preserve of the gentry. In coastal areas, fish was obviously a major part of the diet, but overall the diet was very localised as transport and storage were very difficult. So even for the upper classes who lived well away from the coast, in Toledo for example, sea fish would be a rarity. Food generally was very simply cooked. It was baked, fried and stewed. During the late Middle Ages, better cooking methods evolved using herbs, spices and other ingredients to add some taste and variety. As in other aspects of life, the church played an enormous role in what people could eat and drink. This was common to all countries and all religions. In Catholic Europe, it was forbidden to eat meat for almost 1/3 of the year, so at times the diet was very frugal, sparse and boring. Generally, only 2 meals a day were eaten, a lunch and a light supper. Apart from working men and young people, breakfast was not very popular. Food was eaten either with the hands or a spoon. People often carried their own knife, which they would use to eat. It was only from Italy in the 14th century that the fork first came to be used. Most hot food was prepared over an open fire in the middle of a living area. At some stage, the fire was put against the wall and a chimney was added, as in this picture. But it was only from the 18th century that kitchen stoves became popular. In most towns and villages, there might be a shared oven where people could bring dough and bake it for their own bread. So when not working or idling around the tavern drinking watery beer, what did the average medieval Englishman do? Sports at the time were largely based on combat. The whole structure of medieval society was built around the lord of the manor with his castle and army, there to protect the people so they could go about their lives and of course pay taxes up to the nobility. Popular were sword fights and jousting, particularly amongst the higher social classes, but archery was a sport accessible to all and had low entry costs, but was invaluable to the nobility and the crown. The Archery Act was passed in England in 1252, and all Englishmen between the age of 15 and 60 were by law required to equip themselves with bows and arrows. Areas were created locally for archery practice, and in particular the longbow, which could fire large distances, was popular. The ultimate benefit of this was first seen at the Battle of Crécy versus the French in 1346, when 2,000 French soldiers were killed by the archers and their army then decimated at the cost of 50 English lives. And of course we've all heard tales about the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 and the impact of the longbow there. There were of course other sports linked to fighting like boxing, wrestling and hammer throwing. Other sports included bowls, skittles and early forms of golf. An account from 12th century London described an early form of mass football, or what was known as camp ball, where the ball was taken over long distances from village to village, often resulting in a mass brawl or riot. The rules were quite simple. The ball could be moved in any manner as long as it did not result in murder, a tradition still adopted by the Argentinian national team today. In 1424 the Scottish government outlawed football, and in fact it's still never been played again to this day in Scotland. Of course, for the more peaceful folk there were more genteel pastimes. Chess was brought to England by King Canute in 1013 after encountering the game on a pilgrimage to Rome. In 1027 he ordered the execution of an opponent, the Earl Ulf, who had lost his temper after the king tried to take back a move. Lots of other European monarchs were keen chess players, and Ivan the Terrible of Russia died at the chessboard in 1548. Maybe Putin plays. The game originated in India but was spread wider by the Arabs. Indeed, the term checkmate originates from the Arabic for the king is dead, Shah Mat. Backgammon similarly was Persian in origin and spread into Europe by the Moors. Playing cards were made popular in 13th century Italy, but had actually originated long before that in China and again had been spread into Europe by the Moors. So now on to the bit you've all been waiting for. When looking at sex in the Middle Ages, what you need to be clear on is that sex did not exist, at least in England, until very recently. In medieval times, it was purely a process of reproduction. The discovery of sex in England was confirmed in 1963 by Philip Larkin in his famous poem Annus Mirabilis, as opposed to Queen Elizabeth Annus Horribilis, where he claimed that sex began in 1963 after the end of the Lady Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. The novel Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence was first published in Italy in 1928, which is interesting as it was a devout Roman Catholic country, but in England it was not published until 1960 after a landmark trial for obscenity. The Beatles' first LP, Please Please Me, was released in March 1963. One does suspect that if the Beatles had tried to release Please Please Me in the Middle Ages, it would have met with the same fate as Lady Chatterley, as pleasure was not an objective in medieval sex, at least as far as the church was concerned. Medieval ideas about sex were heavily influenced by the church. The Catholic Church taught that after Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, sex became tainted by lust. Holy men were required to retain their virginity, as Jesus, the Virgin Mary, immaculately, and other saints had done. It didn't stop, however, the church recognising Mary Magdalene, a former prostitute, as a saint, and it didn't stop the rogue activities of many medieval holy men of all ranks. The church had many rules about sex. You couldn't have it before marriage or outside of it. Even when married, you had to be careful. No sex on a Sunday or even Thursday or Friday. None during Lent. None in the days leading to Christmas or certain saint days or feast days. One interesting aside is that in Romanesque churches in the north of Spain, there were many examples of erotic sculptures displayed on church facades. Why is this? Some people argue it was a lesson on what not to do, which is hard to believe, as it's like giving a porn mag to a teenager and saying, don't do this. Obviously the teenager would go away and do what was in the photograph. Was it an incitement to have children when infant mortality was high? Were the figures traps to entice the devil? Or was it just a reflection of normal life? No one really knows. But there are still weekend conferences of Spanish experts debating this today. Nice work if you can get it. So outside of Spain, what happened if you broke the rules and engaged in sex that was not for reproductive purposes with your partner? The church over time developed a complicated set of rules for its clergy as to what penalty or penance to apply for which sins. These were called penitentials. The church basically had the view that sex was not a fundamental right for consenting adults. The purest form of human life was to grow through it as a virgin, but the church understood that physical relations were needed to keep the species going, so sex was regarded by them as a concession, not as a right. The only sex really allowed was missionary, man and wife, but only at certain times and under certain circumstances. On the slide is an imaginary flowchart that a medieval person might keep at their bedside to help them judge if it was safe to have sex. So if a man felt lively, as at the top of the chart, as long as he answered positively to all the points on the chart, the couple could go ahead. A negative on any of them meant that it was sodomy and a penance would have to be applied if confessed. But not only sex with another person was classed as sodomy, a wet dream was subject to penance, although there were other breaches that it's best not to talk about here. One fundamental distinction is the medieval tendency to emphasize active, implicitly male, and passive, female sexual roles. Sex was something that men did to women. Outside of marriage, sex was viewed as fornication and sodomy. In language, verbs associated with sex were in the active voice when performed by men, but were in the passive voice when the woman was the subject. Bedrooms were not private in these times, often shared with children, parents, brothers and sisters, so sex took place a lot outside. It's even been suggested that the dark but dry church was the medieval equivalent of the backseat of the car. The clitoris was unknown in medieval times. It is said that Hippocrates had been aware of it. I'm not sure if his wife was. But it was an Italian in Florence, Pietro d'Abano, who wrote about its powers in 1476. In the picture that's just come up on the slide, you can see the moment of discovery, though the lady involved didn't seem to be enjoying it too much. I'm hoping she was actually dead when this great discovery was made. Today, however, some feminists argue that men have still not discovered it, though it has been spotted recently in Edinburgh, as you can see in this photograph. Town planning at its finest. It was widely believed that the only way to get pregnant was through the missionary position, and hence as pregnancy was the reason for sex, that really was the only acceptable position. But apart from the missionary position, it was generally regarded that it was okay to have sex standing, sitting and side by side. More interesting positions during sex could cause physical defects in babies. Some circumstances could even cause a woman to give birth to a toad. Sex with the woman on top and sex from behind were regarded as particularly dangerous positions. The latter was associated with animals. Women who had twins were believed to have been with two men. Quite how triplets came about, I'm not quite sure. And who knows what's going on in the photo at the bottom, but it was accompanied by a nice tune. Sexually transmitted diseases were seen as punishment from God for immoral acts. Indeed, it was widely believed that leprosy could be sexually transmitted. Gonorrhea was first identified in Persia, and a common treatment was bathing in goat's milk. In most cases, it was the women who were deemed to be the carriers of such diseases, so the cures were mainly directed at them. Syphilis was always foreign. In Italy, Germany and England, it was called the French disease. The French called it the Neapolitan disease, passing the blame back to Italy. Russia called it Polish, Poland called it German, the Turks called it Christian, and the Hindu and Muslim populations of northern India blamed it on each other. Medical treatises recommended the application of various substances, ranging from vinegar to quicklime to diseased genitals. Men, as usual, often had an easier life than women, as a common cure for any sexual transmitted disease was sex with a virgin, so this was hardly a disincentive to get a sexually transmitted disease. I was particularly intrigued by the picture on the right. In some respects, one has to admire the man, but it does look a bit of a strange colour. Men who had sex with men were widely viewed as sexual deviants, with their sinful desires blamed on physical or mental deformities or formative teenage experiences. So really nothing's changed there in the last 1,000 years. Most of the surviving evidence for sexual relations between men is found in court records, notably those of the Office of the Knight, which uncovered thousands of cases in 15th century Florence. It's an interesting place to visit today, but in the 11th to 15th century it must have been an eye-opener, as there were 17,000 men in a population of 14,000 who were prosecuted for indecent acts. Most involved casual sex, but there were also some loving, long-term unions. Female-to-female attraction is almost, but not entirely, invisible. Cases such as that of Guercia, who was banished from Bologna in 1295 for having sex with other women using a dildo-like device, give us a tantalising glimpse of medieval life. We have a modern conception of what sodomy means, and it is generally accepted to mean male homosexuality involving penetration. In the medieval world, penetration was for only one thing, to have children. The purpose of sex was to have children, so any sexual act that didn't contribute to that was sodomy. That meant quite a wide range of sexual activity between same sexes or opposite sexes could be classed as sodomy. In the picture you can see on the screen there's no penetration involved, so this would have been a classic case of sodomy and a committal of sin, although the man involved doesn't seem to be under any particular duress. Then of course, unless you wanted to be cast into the fires of hell after death, you had to go to church to confess the sin of sodomy and receive your penance. Finally, there was the concept of astral sex. An encouragement to evening prayer before sleep was that if you didn't say your prayers, you might then be ravished in the night by a demon. It's interesting that when looking for examples of astral sex, all I could find was examples of demons visiting women. For women, that would have obviously been a traumatic experience. I guess in the case of men, there would be a lot of men who would definitely not say their prayers in the hope of a nocturnal visit from a voluptuous female demon. So finally, in conclusion, a few words about our perceptions of life in the Middle Ages. Of course, it's very difficult to generalise about the picture. Even in today's homogeneous world, people's material existence and behaviour is heavily influenced by culture, geography, social class and wealth. And it was indeed so in medieval times. The life, diet, leisure activities and sex life of a caliph in Islamic Spain were obviously a lot different to that of an agricultural worker in Halifax. And amongst medieval people of the same social class, the experience of food and drink varied enormously due to climate, crops, available animals, etc. Whilst we do have a tendency as we get older to look back nostalgically at previous generations and convince ourselves that life was better in the past, perhaps that is just too much of a stretch to take that back to medieval times. Of course, people at the time did not know anything different. It's a matter of what you don't know, you don't know. Of course, compared to our modern life, it seems difficult. Hard work, cold and comfortable housing, or too hot in summer in places like Spain, a meagre diet, the church interfering in everyday life. But today, younger people look back at our youth and are amazed that we managed to survive without iPhones, air conditioning and central heating. But we did, and so did medieval people, and quite often they seem to have got on with life and enjoyed it. Thank you very much.